on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
If you want to learn trees, you have to discipline yourself to do it because there's a lot more to tree identification than just bark and leaves.
What is a tree? Because sometimes I look at certain species like chokecherries. I'll look at them and I'll be like, is that a tree though? Is that like a shrub? What am I looking at there?
A lot of the pine forests here in eastern North America were just relics of Native American burning.
We've been learning to differentiate the spruces from the hemlock, from the balsams, from the pines, because to her, they were all just pines before. And I think that's true of a lot of people.
For anybody who's trying to learn tree identification, the timing of tree flowering can be essential for tree identification.
The maple syrup season ends. These beautiful red flowers come out and it starts to paint the entire canopy red.
One easy thing that you can do in return for all the trees have given you is just learn their names.
Episode 141 of the WildFed podcast, 100 Trees with Adam Haritan, is brought to you by Surthrival. You've got to try the new naturally flavored colostrum from Surthrival. Chocolate with real cacao, vanilla with real vanilla extract, strawberry with real strawberry juice. I've been using colostrum daily and promoting it as a powerful nutritional supplement for over 15 years. In fact, I just had a quarter cup in my blended drink this morning and again this afternoon. With its ability to fortify your immune system, nourish and rebuild your gut lining, repair injuries, aid in muscle growth and recovery, and so much more, I think it's one of the most sophisticated food-based supplements we can include in our diet. Surthrival's already known as the #1 source for premium colostrum, and now they've just released 3 new formulas: chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. They're lightly sweetened with monk fruit and combined with MCT oil to make them more soluble in water and in blended drinks, all while having the same potency as Surthrival's original colostrum. They're so good, I keep eating them by the spoonful right out of the tub. Eaten like that, they're like a powdered ice cream, but of course they make excellent blended drinks too. Again, these aren't those over-the-top fake flavors you taste in so many supplements today. These are flavored with real cacao, vanilla, and strawberry, so they taste great and really clean too. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup of health-promoting supplements and superfoods and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? Do you love mushrooms? Do you know that eating mushrooms is called mycophagy? Mushrooms are, of course, a cornerstone of the wild food experience, but learning about them can be daunting. Would you like to learn to identify and harvest mushrooms, but you aren't quite sure where to start? Then it's time to check out the North American Mycological Association. The North American Mycological Association has 97 affiliate clubs across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, so there's probably a chapter near you. You can check them out at namyco.org. For a completely immersive and in-person experience, including lectures, workshops, foraging, and of course, mycophagy, you can attend their annual foray. The 2022 foray will be held in the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. Again, go to namyco.org to register. When you do, mention WildFed and you'll get a free copy of Maxine Stone's book, Missouri Wild Mushrooms, when you attend. Again, go to namyco.org to get started. The North American Mycological Association, promoting, pursuing, and advancing mycology. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. My guest today, now back for his second appearance, is Adam Haritan of LearnYourLand.com. He's probably best known for his fantastic YouTube channel by the same name. He's got over 175 videos there that teach folks how to identify and use the wild species found all around them. Recently, he launched a tree identification course that caught my eye, and I thought it'd be fun to talk with him about trees from a wild food perspective. Of course, trees provide us with so much, and it's easy to take that for granted. Wood to build our homes and for fuel, fruits and nuts for food, but it goes much further than that. From maple syrup, a simple carbohydrate source we can easily manufacture at home, to pine pollen that's abundantly available in the spring as a testosterone support, to the edible spring leaves of the basswood. Many trees are important to the forager. In addition, they often host mushrooms that we prize as well, like the chaga we harvest exclusively from birch trees to the maitake that's found just on oaks. It turns out that while most new foragers tend to get pretty focused on annual and biannual herbaceous plants or fruiting shrubs, knowing the trees where you live can really accelerate your ability to utilize the wild resources on your landscape. So, like the Lorax, Adam and I are here today to speak for the trees, encouraging you, if you haven't already, to get to know them a bit. After all, they can enrich your life, feed and heat you and your family, and convert the so-called wall of green that most botanically illiterate folks see in the woods, on the side of the road, or the side of the trail, from a conglomerate of trunks and leafy canopies to a dynamic intermingled party of individual species that we call a forest. It starts just like getting to know people, one species at a time. Adam Haritan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it really should be welcome back to the show.
Yeah, welcome back to me. I'll congratulate myself.
Man, I'm so curious to hear about your new project, which is all about learning 100 trees. And I just went to the webpage, which I saw the registration was closed. So it looks like you guys are underway. Tell me about the project and what you're working on.
Yeah, you missed the registration by about a couple weeks. But the last time we talked, which was maybe 2 years ago, I kind of hinted at this project. I was just starting my work on it. But ever since then, I've been working on it, literally hardly any days off. So I just kind of went head first into it and never took my head out of it and took a breath. I just kept working and working and working. And I finally released it a couple weeks ago. So the end of May, early June. And it's been an incredible project. I learned a lot. I worked a lot. I worked a lot. I worked a lot. I worked a lot. But ultimately, it was so rewarding. And it's still rewarding because I'm still learning a lot of stuff about, the local trees around here, the trees that are not too local to me, but ones that I have to drive pretty far to find, but that might be local to other people. But it's been neat to kind of shift away from mushrooms for a bit because I think a lot of people knew me as the mushroom guy, even though I never used that term for myself. People would just designate me as the mushroom guy. And I would always say, I'm not the mushroom guy. Trust me, I'm not the mushroom guy. But behind the scenes, I was kind of working on other stuff. And yeah, the tagline for the course is to help you identify 100 trees. But to be more specific, there's probably 109 trees in there. But more than just teaching you how to specifically identify particular trees, it really teaches you how to identify trees in general, like what to look for when you're attempting to identify trees. And I don't think a lot of field guides actually go into that kind of information in depth. They kind of just, maybe give you a broad overview of trees, then kind of get into the main features of each particular tree. But this one kind of starts from the very beginning, introduces you to what a tree is, tree anatomy, tree ecology, physiology, etymology, and so on. And then by the end of the course, you should be able to successfully identify at least 100 trees that grow in Eastern North America.
Wow. Let's take a step back. Your big picture project is Learn Your Land. And I'm curious a little bit about sort of how you came to decide to do this tree project, but give people a bit of an overview of what your work's been over the last several years. And then I want to talk about why trees.
So Learn Your Land was first started many years ago as a way to connect naturalists, so people who teach skills, whether it's foraging or plant identification or anything related to nature. I wanted to connect those people with people who are interested in learning those skills because I saw myself as both of those people. I was teaching skills at the time, but I was also really interested in learning a lot. And clearly I still belong to both of those camps. I know a couple things, but there's so much that I don't know. And so I'm constantly trying to learn from other naturalists. And I wanted to create a database online. And I had so many high hopes for this project, but unfortunately, I'm not a software developer. And I didn't have the money to keep paying people to keep developing this product. And it just never really took off. It was very, very local, mostly to Western Pennsylvania. And so I kind of scrapped that project because while I was doing that, I was also filming tutorial videos and just putting them on YouTube. And that was actually gaining some traction. And then the mushroom videos actually really gained the most traction, which is why I guess I kind of became known as the mushroom guy around here. And so I just kept doing that and doing that and doing that. And then over time, it's like, well, in the wintertime, there's not many mushrooms around here, but I want to continue putting out content. So I would just film other things as well, trees. I would do a lot of plant foraging as well, maybe just general nature philosophy stuff as well. But I would just keep posting and posting and posting. And then over time, it just slowly morphed away from mushrooms into trees. And it wasn't really a conscious decision. I was just kind of led in that general direction. And I thought, I did a mushroom course a couple years ago. It did pretty well. And I thought, well, I don't think there's a tree course to teach people how to identify trees online here in Eastern North America. So I decided to just fill that gap and then to do that work.
There's, first I want to ask this kind of like really basic question, which when I say it to the listener is probably going to be like, why even ask? It seems so obvious, but there's like gray area sometimes where I am curious. So let's start with like, what is a tree? Because sometimes I look at certain species, like here in the Northeast, our choke cherries, I'll look at them and I'll be like, is that a tree though? Or is that like a shrub? What am I looking at there? So it's particularly when it comes to that gray area, how do we define and like, what is a tree?
So what is a tree is the third video in the course. It's not a very long video because it is kind of it seems like it's such an obvious answer to a question that shouldn't be asked. But I ask that question to myself all the time as well. And I thought, this question needs to be answered, or at least attempted to be answered, because sometimes the definitions aren't that clear. And like you said with chokecherry, is it a tree? Is it a shrub? What's the difference between a tree and a shrub? What's the difference between a tree and, when we look at a flower like a marigold or a chrysanthemum, it's like clearly we could see some differences, but what really are the differences between these two groups of organisms? And so there are standard definitions of trees, and typically one common factor of all trees is that they're perennial. So they grow year after year after year, potentially. Obviously something can kill them, something can uproot them. We could kill them, we could uproot them, but they're perennial. So this differs from the annual life cycle or the biennial life cycle. So a chokecherry clearly is a perennial, but is a perennial a tree or a shrub? And so what's the difference between a tree or a shrub? So in this course, I do include a lot of shrubs, but some of these can be tree-like at maturity. And I do include chokecherry because sometimes I'll look at it and it's like, yeah, that's a tree. Other times it's like, nah, it's more like a shrub. So what tree people define as a tree compared to a shrub would be a tree is typically single-trunked, while a shrub is typically multi-trunked. But that's not always so crystal clear because sometimes I look at a black cherry and you'll see multiple trunks coming up from the base. Or you take a look at American basswood and it's not uncommon to see 3, 4, 5 huge trunks coming up from the base.
How about a silver maple?
Sometimes this is just natural. Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of trees that do this. Sometimes we can artificially create that through coppicing, or sometimes it just naturally happens. But typically shrubs are multi-trunked. Typically trees are single-trunked. And then there's all these definitions about how tall a tree must be. And there's all these different measurements that are thrown out there depending on whose research you're reading. But I think somewhere around the potential to be 15 feet high, so 15 feet high, is pretty much a tree. If it can grow that high or larger and tends to be single-trunked. If it's usually smaller at max height and it's multi-trunked, it's usually a shrub. But they're all perennials, and so that's different than something that's an annual or biennial. And woody, of course. Trees have woody tissue.
And like a tree, though, a lot of the shrubs will also have annual growth rings, and they'll have a cambium layer. So structurally, shrubs can be very similar to trees. So largely, it's really just a height and whether or not they're multi-trunk type of thing.
Yeah, in my research, I haven't found any differences structurally or anatomically between trees and shrubs, unless we're talking about like differences between angiosperms and gymnosperms, which some people call like hardwoods or conifers. That's where it gets different structurally speaking. But as far as when you look at a shrub or a tree, a lot of it's just subjective.
And this is obviously like arbitrary too, right? This is like human beings try to categorize something that doesn't necessarily have like an ultra clean definition. So it's not
for sure
evolutionarily
and
things.
Yeah, and then you take a look at something like American chestnut today, which has been reduced from a large overstory tree to almost a shrubby tree because it doesn't really have the potential, in many cases, to grow to a very large tree because of the chestnut blight that just basically destroyed all the large trees throughout the first half of the 20th century. So that's something that within just 50 years was transformed from a tree almost to a shrub. But we still call it a tree.
Yeah, wow.
Nobody says like the American chestnut shrub.
Right. What about something like the saguaro cactus? I mean, this is not a tree, right? Like it gets referred to as like a saguaro forest, and it's got those woody ribs to it. But obviously this is a cactus, so like not a tree, right? Even though it's 15 feet tall, it hits a lot of those categories, but it's something else entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too familiar with cacti just because where I live, they're just not that common.
You don't have them in Pennsylvania.
So, I mean, clearly I didn't include any cacti in this course, and I really don't talk about it. But it is interesting because in some of these tree guides, they do include cacti and yuccas and other related organisms.
Right. Because they'll say like Joshua tree, for instance, right, which is a yucca.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it gets a little confusing sometimes at the margins of these things. And then, like we were saying, it's kind of arbitrary in some cases too. And we did an episode of WildFed, the TV show, recently. I always have to differentiate because there's the podcast. And I know that not everybody who listens to the podcast has seen the show. So I'm always like, the WildFed TV show. But we did an episode of the show where we feature squirrel hunting and acorn foraging. And my wife is in it, and she does this like really cool, vulnerable piece where she's like, when I first met Daniel, like I didn't really know how to identify an oak tree. And then she holds out this red oak leaf, and she's like, so for those of you like me, this is the leaf from a red oak, you know? And it's this really sweet scene because it's easy to forget. You know, for me, I'm far from like an expert on trees, but where I live, I can, you know, identify at least at the genus level most of the trees here. And you get used to being able to do that and forget that the average kind of member of the public might not even be able to identify really like very common trees that, you know, somebody who spends time in the outdoors would know. Just maybe they wouldn't even remember when they learned it. Like they've known maple trees for so long or something. And I can take that for granted at times. But the average member of the public probably couldn't really identify too many tree species, unless there's one, maybe they've planted it before, they have one in their yard that they've sort of haphazardly learned the name of. But it's not as though people are tree literate by and large, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, similar to your wife, I think when I met you many years ago, I probably couldn't even identify an oak tree either. I don't think you were the one that taught me how to identify oak, but at the time, I probably didn't know how to identify it. But over time, I mean, I learned a lot of this stuff. And you're right. Many, many people, I mean, I don't know the exact number of people who aren't tree literate, but a lot of them are tree illiterate. And it's interesting because at least here in like temperate Eastern North America, they're so common. And they're all around us. It's like this area just wants to be forested. Like we have to actively deforest this area and keep it deforested, or else woody vegetation is just going to grow back pretty quickly. But it's so obvious, yet people don't see it. And I think that explains a lot of things in life as well. It's like the things that are most obvious, people just want to look for something else, maybe something more novel.
Something more exotic. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, just take diet, for example. I mean, the most basic diet tenets, like, you know, eat quality food, eat your vegetables, eat some fruit, drink water, and then lifestyle, like sleep and exercise. This is probably the best thing that you can do. Yet everybody wants like those superfoods from somewhere else in the world, or that one magic thing that's going to change everything. But the thing with trees is I think it's because it's just right in front of us all the time. We either think we'll eventually learn it just through osmosis. And I know a lot of people who treat trees like that, you know, in mushroom circles or in foraging circles or in birding circles. We just think that by spending time outside, we'll eventually learn the trees. The names will just come to us, or people just never even bother to learn them. But if you want to learn trees, you have to discipline yourself to do it, because there's a lot more to tree identification than just bark and leaves. There's so much more to it. But I think that's all people believe that tree identification is. And so it doesn't seem sexy enough. It just seems like, you know, it's always there. I can get to it whenever I want to. But with a mushroom, it'll pop up every now and then. You might not see it for a couple years. And that intrigues people. Or with plant foraging, it's kind of similar. You might be looking for something that you've never seen before, and you could do something with it immediately. But with a tree, it's just there. It's always going to be there, at least in our eyes. And so we'll eventually get to it. But
I've got 100 years before that tree's gone, so I'll figure it out.
Yeah,
I find it interesting when folks are involved in the building industry or carpentry, because they hear the word pine and they're picturing the wood and its grain as a finished product. Or maple, they're picturing flooring or cabinetry or oak. Does that make sense? And I'll hear those words and I picture the species. I don't work with wood specifically very much. So like I have some friends who are builders, and I notice whenever these words come up, they mean different things to us. So that always really fascinates me, because, they'll say, or like sometimes the gun guys will say like hickory, and they're thinking about like a wood-stocked rifle. And I'm thinking of the tree species, So that's like one area where I notice that the common names mean different things to different people, that they're not always necessarily referencing the actual living species, but maybe a product instead, which I don't say as like as a negative against anybody. It's just like one of those things where it's the different silos that we're in or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up a good point that we depend on trees for many different things. I mean, not just for guns or not just for flooring, but like with every breath of air that we breathe, we depend on trees. For clean water, we depend on trees. For shade on a hot, sunny day, we depend on trees. For food, we depend on trees. Even if you're not a forager, it's like you eat a lot of trees. If you eat apples, you're eating trees. If you're eating plums, if you're eating almonds, you're eating trees. If you're eating nuts, a lot of times these come from trees. And so we depend on them. And so what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to ignore that fact? Are you never going to appreciate the fact that you depend on trees for sustenance? Or will you do something about it? And one easy thing that you can do in return for all the trees have given you is just learn their names. And I understand that these are human names that we're putting on trees, but whenever you do put a name on something, you're placing sustained attention on it. And to me, that's an act of reciprocity.
Yeah, there's like a neuroscience piece to this too. It's easy to say that like, oh, we if you don't know the name of something, like there's that tendency to ignore it. And then once you know the name of it, there's a tendency to feel sort of intimacy with the thing. And so it's funny how I've noticed in the just hanging around with naturalists and doing the foraging thing, I can see a plant all the time and be intrigued by like, I wonder what it is. And then the moment I know its name, everything changes. Like my relationship with it completely changes. And when you look back at like, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Adam and Eve are instructed to go name everything. And it's like, I think there's a little glimpse into neuroscience there. It's like, once we know the name of something, we feel like we know it. And so that's such an important piece. I also wanted to say that it's one thing to, I think for a lot of folks, leaves are their principal way of identifying trees. And so, I remember when I first started to tap maple trees, and I had a buddy over, and he had to teach me to identify the bark of the maples in my yard, because without the leaves there, I was at a loss as to which trees to tap in the late winter. And so since then, winter buds have become useful to me in identification. Bark has become useful to me in identification. And then over time, looking at a winter canopy of deciduous trees, now I have a little bit more pattern recognition about how they look skylined, all of their branchlets. Like I think the first time I really noticed that was with ash trees. And I was like, oh, they're, very distinctive growth pattern that I could pick out. Then over time, you start to get better at that. And then identifying trees, when they're defoliated becomes easier, but it's easy to get reliant on just foliage as your main, way of identifying.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that about tapping trees and figuring out what tree it was based on bark, because the first year that I tapped trees, I tapped mulberry trees. Thinking that they were maples. Now, in my defense, there were a bunch of maples in the area, and almost every tree I tapped was a maple, but there were a couple of Asian mulberries interspersed. I mean, this was in a city park in Pittsburgh, by the way, like by my house, like right in the city. Like I found this park by my house, and I would go back there and tap sugar. There was one sugar maple that was there, but there were a bunch of Norway maples, which everybody says now you shouldn't tap Norway maples because of the milky sap. I didn't know the difference back then, and I thought it was delicious. Maybe it was a little cloudy, but there were some mulberries in there as well. And it's kind of funny because this was obviously public property, so anybody could go in this park, and I would just leave these jugs bungee cord to the trees like overnight for weeks. People would steal
gorilla style.
People would steal the bungee cords, but leave the jug of maple sap there. And I thought, oh, you didn't even take the best part. Like I could always replace the bungee cord.
Bungee cord was to keep it from swinging in the wind or something?
Yeah, just to keep the jug firmly attached because it was pretty windy up there. And I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to fall off. I mean, this was like really DIY.
You were gorilla tapping a park for sap.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So gangster.
Yeah, and so the mulberries don't yield sap if anybody's interested.
Good to know.
Anyway, so I slowly learned over time how to identify trees by bark. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I mean, sometimes it can be quite difficult when you're first starting out. But over time, you realize that all these trees look different. Every single species does. At first, it can be overwhelming. I mean, whenever someone's learning mushrooms, most mushrooms can look similar, or weeds in their backyard, they can all look pretty similar. But there's so many differences between them. And unfortunately, a lot of field guides actually don't highlight a lot of these subtle differences. And so I try to put a lot of that into this tree course, whether it's the presence of little stipules that differentiate between black maple and sugar maple. And these two trees can look nearly identical, but one of the big differences is that in the spring season, for just a couple weeks, black maple has these little paired stipules at the base of the leaf, and sugar maple never has that. But most field guides never say anything like that. But it's really neat because, again, going back to learning mushrooms or plants, and there's this sexiness factor with them. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, where they're colorful or they're ephemeral. They pop up. Sometimes they're not there. But with trees, a lot of those things are on trees as well, like flowers. Sometimes these flowers are very short-lived. And if you don't catch them at a certain time, you won't see them for another year. Like flowers on an American beach. We're all familiar with beech nuts or beech bark or beech leaves. But what about the flowers? What do they look like? And are they differentiated into male and female flowers? And the answer is yes, they are differentiated into male and female flowers. And so going into this project, I honestly didn't know a lot of these differences. But that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do it, because I wanted to force myself to notice as much as I possibly could at the macroscopic level. Mm-hmm. I'm not that interested in going microscopically with trees at this point, but macroscopically, I wanted to see as much as I could and then teach those observations and skills to others.
How has it been received so far by the participants? And are folks kind of learning in the way that you'd hope they would?
Yeah, for sure. So I've gotten a lot of great feedback so far. It's only been open for a couple of weeks. So there's probably 26 hours of lessons in this course. So I imagine it'll take a while. Nobody's going to sit down in 26 hours and complete it. But it is go at your own pace. So anybody can pause it or rewatch things or take their time with it. And I find that a lot of people do, especially in the summer season, because a lot of people are traveling. But whenever people have time, you could just go back in and watch the whole thing or just pause and skip around a bit.
When I think about different tree species and what they have offered to me personally, I mean, there are some that are so abundant and they give so many valuable resources that I hold them in such high esteem. So, yesterday we were filming a dinner sequence for season 3 of WildFed where we had tapped birch trees early in the season, yellow birches, and which I believe is Betulus alleghaniensis. Anyway, so we had tapped these birches and, we drank the sap. We concentrated the sap into a concentrate and then also, cooking it all the way down into a birch syrup. And one of the things I did yesterday was serve birch concentrate, sap concentrate, carbonated. So I got it down to like the sweetness of little less sweet than, let's say, like a Coca-Cola or something, and then carbonated it. And that drink was awesome. It was so awesome. And because it had that color of a cola almost too, because it was, the caramelization of the fructose and glucose that are in that sap. So that was a really cool drink. And then obviously cooking it down to syrup is so useful. And then for those of us in the, who live amongst birch trees, we're so blessed to have that fire resource of that incredibly flammable, papery bark that is on the tree. It's like so useful there. It's a fantastic firewood. Which I burn throughout the winter time. So I look at a tree like that and it's like, man, it's providing me food. It's providing me that, initial, tinder and kindling that I need to get a fire going. It's providing me wood for the fire. And then even like chew sticks I get off of the yellow birches, like when I'm out in the woods, I'll chew on that bark on the branchlets for that wintergreen oil or clean my teeth with them when I'm out hiking. I just love, for me, like that's a tree. When I think about it, like what a friend, what a friend and how much it offers. And I just could go down the list. I mean, there's so many trees like that, but that's one that really stands out to me that as somebody who loves wild foods, and like you were saying before, it's really easy to get focused on annuals, on biennials, on shrubs for their fruits and things like that, and mushrooms, and overlook how valuable the trees are and what they provide.
Did you force carbonate the sap in order to get it carbonated?
Yeah, I used a soda stream.
Okay, cool.
And I actually pushed carbonation right into it, which the machine tells you not to do, but you're supposed to carbonate water. But I thought it was worth it, and it just came out so good.
Yeah, that sounds good. I've used black birch twigs to make a root beer mead.
Oh, cool.
And would naturally let that ferment. And I got some carbonation out of that naturally, but it probably wasn't as carbonated.
They have that wintergreen oil as well, right?
Yeah, I think it has a little more than yellow birch or golden birch. I don't know if black birch grows as far north as Maine, though. Or
I don't see it very often. Do you get chaga on that species?
We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, right now I'm wearing my new WildFed hoodie. We really took our time choosing these hoodie blanks before we had them printed. They've got a charcoal body and an olive green hood and sleeves, and they've got our Food Is All Around You logo on the front with a really cool foraging basket, fishing rod, and suppressed rifle on the back with the text Hunt, Forage, Fish. These are super soft and comfortable, look great, and work well in the field or in town. I really love the thickness too. They're fairly light and perfect for the spring days and summer nights ahead. Right now, they're 10% off with the coupon code HFF10 at wild-fed.com. Show your love for WildFed and the wild food lifestyle. Head over to wild-fed.com and use the coupon code HFF10, that's shorthand for Hunt, Forage, Fish 10, for 10% off your new favorite hoodie. Now, back to the show.
Yes, it's way more common on yellow birch, though, but I've seen it on black birch every now and then. But it seems like yellow birch is just a bigger host for it.
Because, that's another thing I didn't even just mention. I was just going off the list of things I love about birch trees. Let me add that. It hosts one of the most important mushrooms to me, which is chaga. And, not only because I produce a product from it, but because I produce medicine at home and I drink a tea of it every day, just about every day. So, then it's also not only is the birch genus friend to me, but then it's a friend to another species that's a friend to me. So it's just like I said, I could go down the list. Another one is like the pine trees. Like here, largely Pinus strobus, the white pine. I mean, the vitamin C in the needles. I eat those early tassels. I use the pollen off of the tree to tincture. Again, I use the dried dead wood all the time to start fires, to kindle fires, like the dry twigs. They're hanging dry, dead all year. So it's like easy to go up to a pine tree, pull off some of those lower branches and get a fire going. That inner bark is edible in a pinch. So that's one I know like I can rely on if I need it. It makes fantastic watertight baskets if you get that spring bark. I mean, I just go on and on with like just this one, pine trees, like what they provide for us. Again, just this incredible resources. I mean, the idea, and then, I'm sitting in a house probably largely built out of pine, or at least that contains quite a lot of pine. So again, just picking any genus, it's like, man, the gifts of these species. Curious if you have anything to say about pines in general.
I love pines. One of the coolest places here in Western Pennsylvania is an old growth forest that contains 350-year-old pines that are close to 170 feet tall.
Wow.
One of the tallest was near 180 feet, I think, but it recently fell a couple years ago.
What species?
So yeah, I've always loved pine. It was Eastern white pine, or it is Eastern white pine. But we've got many species around here. It's interesting. I'm reading that Forgotten Fires book. You might be familiar with it. Omar Stewart and M. Cat Anderson. Just talking about how a lot of the pine forests here in Eastern North America were just relics of Native American burning.
Yeah.
And how a lot of these forests actually want to be hardwood forests or deciduous forests with other trees that aren't that adapted to fire. But when you bring fire in, you can manage a lot of these forests to be strictly pine. And a lot of these pine species are so valuable, like you just mentioned before, for building, for food, for medicine. There's just so many uses for them. So anytime I see pines, I'm usually pretty excited. And they're also a great genus to learn because there's a lot of them. Sometimes there's very subtle differences between species. So it really takes a lot of like keen observational skills to tell the differences between some of these. And in some cases, it's really easy to identify pines just because they've got leaves all year long. And so with evergreens, sometimes it's just a bit easier because you have more features to go off of. And leaves are pretty diagnostic, cones as well for a lot of pines.
Yeah, a lot of times it's as simple as counting the number of leaves in a fascicle, right? To differentiate, out here. And that's another point I want to bring up is that a lot of folks go like, oh, those are leaves, because our tree ignorance is profound given how important they are to us, So it's like, I thought they were needles. It's like, well, yeah, those are leaves. I often think about how the pines can see in 360 degrees because, when you look at like, let's say just a broadleaf, like a maple leaf or an oak leaf, it kind of exists in just that like two dimensions. So it's got like the front face and the back face of the leaf. And most of that chlorophyll is really concentrated on that front face of the leaf. So it's like it sees in one direction. But then, when you think about having chlorophyll 360 degrees around that needle, it's almost like the tree can see in every direction. I often think about that because I imagine if I stand in front of a tree and my shadow's cast upon it, then the chlorophyll where my shadow isn't receiving light. And if the plant has any ability to discern that, then it can kind of see a little bit. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but that is really interesting.
One of the funny things here in the state of Maine is our state tree is the white pine. And we're known as the pine tree state. And there's been this movement recently because we have just one of the most hideous state flags in the union. It's in my opinion terrible. And when I travel around, one of the things I like to do is come back I like to get the Velcro tactical patches of the state flags that I go to. Anyway, Maine's is one that I'm always like a little embarrassed of. But there's been this movement to return to our original state flag, which is a pine tree in the center of a white field with a single star in the corner. And I love that flag. There's been lately a lot of like state pride stuff. So you'll see people wearing shirts, COVID masks, whatever, that have the stickers, flags in their yard or whatever of the original state flag. So there's a movement to try to bring it back as our official state flag again. The problem, and you're probably already guessing it, is almost always it's got a spruce tree on it. And there's this issue with people thinking every evergreen tree that they see, every coniferous tree is a pine. And so another one is we have a microbrewery here. Actually, they've grown quite a bit, called Lone Pine. And, again, their logo, it's the spruce logo. And I just kind of want to like scream from the rooftops, like, that's not a pine. So we have this issue with like people picture a Christmas tree type shape, like a blue spruce, that conical shape. when they imagine a pine tree. And it's like, the white pines here don't look anything like that. So that's something I've noticed very often. And, my wife Avani's been learning the different coniferous trees here. We've been going through the leaves, learning to differentiate the spruces from the hemlock, from the balsams, from the pines. And that's been really cool to watch, because to her, they were all just pines before. And I think that's true of a lot of people. Have you noticed that?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I was filming balsam fir for the course last year. And here in Pennsylvania, this might shock you, but balsam fir is not that common. It's actually a pretty rare tree in Pennsylvania because it's more of a boreal species.
Yeah, right.
But we've got some pockets where it does grow. So I had to drive maybe 300 miles to find balsam fir.
Oh, wow.
And I arrived at this really remote, swampy area. Like, you have to take all these back roads. You're driving through this kind of like a mountainous area in order to get there, which is also not that common where I live in Western Pennsylvania. So I wasn't quite used to doing this kind of stuff. Anyway, I get up to this remote swamp area, and I'm there to find balsam fir. And I kind of got lost in this swampy area, but I eventually ran into a hunter who was deer hunting up there. Really nice guy, incredibly nice guy. And he was asking me all these questions because he did not expect to find somebody with a camera just walking around. Yeah. I mean, with a firearm or with a bow for sure, but somebody with like a camera and like a small vehicle in this backcountry area. And he asked why I was up there. And I said, I'm up here to film a tree. He couldn't believe that either. Like, why would somebody be out in the middle of nowhere just filming a tree with like a big smile on my face? I'm filming a tree. And he wanted to know what tree I was filming. And I said, balsam fir. And he kind of looked at me like, balsam fir. And I said, yeah, it's this tree right here. And we were standing right in front of it. And he said, we just call those pines. And I thought, wow. Here's this tree that's not common here. And it's pretty rare in Pennsylvania. And you just think it's a pine. And that's perfectly fine because honestly, like you said, I was always calling any conifer a pine as well. Like when I was tapping that mulberry tree, at the same time, there was a Norway spruce outside of my place, and I called that a pine as well. But then over the years, I kind of realized that, okay, in the defense of people who do call those trees pines, they are technically in the pine family.
Yeah.
So we could be kind of lenient with them and just say, okay, you're kind of correct in the sense that it's in the pine family, like hemlocks in the pine family, spruces are in the pine family, larches are in the pine family. So I guess they could be considered pines, just like when you look at a flower that's in the Asteraceae family, a lot of people just say it's an aster or it's a mustard, even though it might not be like the mustard genus. But you're right, there are differences between all those groups of trees, and they're actually pretty easy to learn as well because there aren't that many different genera of evergreen conifers in Eastern North America. And so you only really have to learn differences between maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 different genera, which actually isn't too much. And there are very noticeable differences, like you said, just in the leaves alone. And while pines do have the needle-like leaves, I mean, if you look at something like a hemlock, they're not like sharp or anything. I mean, those are flattened in a lot of cases with balsam fir as well. So yeah, I am recovering from calling everything a pine, but
I'm not making fun of people because
I know
guilty. You know what I mean? Guilty. Like I'm remembering back to my early foraging days, and it's funny because when I was new at it, everybody wanted me to take them on foraging walks or plant identification walks, and I just had no idea. Now I think I'm at a place now where I've got a bit of a humbleness and awareness about how much I don't know. But when I was new at it, I think I lacked some of that. Anyway, I remember being in Canada and some folks asked me if I would take them on a plant ID walk. And for sure, I knew enough plants to do that, but there was you just got to stay focused on what you know because there's so many things I didn't know. Anyway, I remember pointing out a balsam and having everybody go over, those blisters all over the trunk that contain that balsam sap. And we were messing with that. And a guy comes over to me and goes, dude, that's not a balsam, that's a fir. And I was like, no, dude, it's a balsam. We get in a back and forth. This is a good friend of mine, Avasa. He was actually part of my wedding, in the end. So we're really good friends. But at the time, we didn't know each other that well. And we're going back and forth. And it's like, it was for a couple of years later that I learned it's a balsam fir, and I was like, "Oh, we were both arguing different, the suffix versus prefix of its common name." Like I felt so stupid. I ended up contacting him out of the blue after many years to be like, "Hey, just want you to know, you were right. It's a fir. And I was right. It's a balsam. But yeah, that's the thing. It's like those short flattened leaves. Once you understand like what the leaves of pines look like, generally speaking, it's a lot more easy to differentiate. So just like I find all that really fascinating. And actually, same thing when you read early, writings from settlers who came over from Europe. I mean, they just called anything that was coniferous a pine. So I think that's a pretty common one. I'm curious, sort of like you get the theme of where I've been going with some of these trees. Are there any things like that stand out to you, similarly with any of the other genera?
Where people call one thing something, but it's
actually
or
different. Just sort of some common errors that get made or common misconceptions about species.
I mean, I guess a lot of times when you add actually one of the biggest misconceptions is regarding the mulberry. And actually Sam Thayer taught me this years ago, so I got to give him credit for it. But I am obsessed with finding mulberries around here. And I know I did mention mulberry because I tapped it, but maybe that was setting the seed for things to come later in my life. But here in Eastern North America, at least up in the temperate regions, we've got two pure species of mulberry, at least, which is red mulberry and white mulberry. And whenever I would forage for mulberries back in the city of Pittsburgh over a decade ago, I would see, okay, these mulberry trees produce red fruits, and so this is red mulberry. And some of the mulberry trees would produce like whiter fruits or purplish fruits, even at maturity. And I would think, okay, maybe that's the white mulberry. But then when I was hanging out with Sam many years ago, he was obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with walking around this park. We were in the city of Pittsburgh. I mean, you know Sam and his personality. We were walking around this city park, and there's a ton of American basswood. And he's like, there's got to be a red mulberry in here. There's got to be a red mulberry in here. And I was thinking, there's probably not a red mulberry in here. And I was asking him why he was so interested in it. And he was saying, because a lot of times people consider the white mulberry to be red mulberry, but it's a completely different species. So red mulberry is Morus rubra, and the white or Asian mulberry is Morus alba. And the thing, at least where I live, is that red mulberry is actually incredibly rare. There's only like probably a handful of populations, decent sized trees here in Pennsylvania. And actually most botanists who know a thing or two about trees here in Pennsylvania have actually never seen a true red mulberry. I know a couple spots where it grows, but I got to drive pretty far, maybe into Ohio or down into Kentucky to find a lot. But both trees produce red fruits at maturity. But red mulberry is completely different because it likes north-facing slopes. It likes well-drained woods. It grows in association with like tulip poplar, shellbark hickory, with American basswood, which is confusing because it kind of looks like American basswood. While white mulberry or Asian mulberry is just a disturbance-prone species that really likes old farms, abandoned fields, lots, like cracks in city sidewalks. And so the habitat preferences are different. But the thing today is that one of the reasons that red mulberry is on the decline is that the two trees hybridize with one another. So you see a lot of hybrids between both species. And that's true here in Pennsylvania. You see a tree that kind of looks like it would be Morus rubra, but it has characteristics of the Asian mulberry. And it turns out that it's a hybrid species. But Sam really turned me onto that years ago. And it's fun for me trying to find the native species just because it's not that common around here. But I think that's one of the misconceptions, because if you look on like Facebook plant ID groups and somebody posts a picture of any mulberry whose fruit is red, they consider it to be the native species. And technically it's not.
Pretty understandable mistake there. So are you saying then when you see the differences in fruit colors, that's just phenotypic?
Yes. I mean, American mulberry or red mulberry, Morus rubra, the fruits are almost always red or purple or dark purplish red at maturity. But with the Asian mulberry, it could be a variety of different colors. And that's pretty true for a lot of trees that were introduced to North America and that were attempted to be cultivated. You see that they typically have more phenotypic variation compared to native species, which tend to be pretty true to their characteristics.
Well, now I'm feeling very jealous about the mulberry trees where you live, as we don't really see them up here. So thanks a lot for that. Yeah, you got some access to some fruits down there. Do you guys have pawpaws growing in Pennsylvania?
Oh, you didn't see my latest video, did you?
I did. Well, I actually did see the thumbnail for it, but I didn't know for sure where you were, and I didn't get a chance to watch it.
Okay, so actually I wasn't in Pennsylvania for that, but we do get pawpaws here. They're They're common, but they're not incredibly common. Because if you look at the distribution range of the species, it does reach into Pennsylvania and farther north, but it doesn't cover the entire state.
Yeah.
And because it really likes floodplain woods and like rich, moist woods, a lot of those areas were developed pretty early on. And so just through habitat loss alone, we don't see as many as probably did grow here a couple centuries ago. But yeah, it's one of my favorite plants to find and eat and grow as well. We got a couple pawpaws outside.
Oh, cool. You consider it a shrub or a tree?
I call it a tree, but in the video, I do say it can be shrub-like or it can be shrubby. But I mean, it does have the potential just to have a single trunk with a definite crown, and it can grow up to 40 feet tall. So most shrubs probably won't grow that tall.
I have never been around them when they're fruiting, so I've only seen them off season. And so this September, I'll be down with Michael Judd in where's he at? Maryland, and pretty excited about that to finally get around some, because I mean they're just like one of my favorite wild foods to eat from North America, and I think there's something so special about them, their unique traits, and them being in this far into the temperate region. So I'm really excited about that. And also going back, I'm going to spend a week with Sam Thayer coming up here for an episode of the show as well. So pretty excited to get around him again. And like you were saying, just watching him run around looking for things is so exciting. Most episodes we build out for WildFed, it's like we start with a target species, a plant, an animal, and that's what we want to make the show about. But when I was talking to Sam the other day, I was like, yeah, we're not doing that. We're just going to chase you around with the camera. He says to me, he's like, and we always have like a animal component too, to the meal. So he says, as you can imagine, he's like, one of the things I'm really good at is catching animals with my bare hands. So I like to do some of that.
I've seen it.
He's like, he told me the other day he can like, I'm trying to think of how I would describe what he was telling me. It sounds like he can persistence hunt a gray squirrel. He's like telling me that if you have two people, you can wear a squirrel out and like basically climb a tree and catch it. And I was, like the way that you've seen probably like the San out in Africa, like run down a kudu, takes like half a day, but they'll just exhaust it by chasing it till it can't run anymore and overheats. Like he's can do that with gray squirrels, which I just never imagined was a thing, but that's pretty exciting to me. So.
He is such an inspiration. I'll tell you why. When I was filming this tree project, like clearly I had a list of trees to do, and in most cases you have to go pretty far in order to find some of these things. You're not going to find all the species growing within like 2 miles of your home.
Right.
And it can seem pretty daunting and intimidating. Like, what's the point of doing all of this work and driving around and finding this stuff? And actually, if you read old biographies of like early settlers and early botanists and people who would ship plants back to England or to Europe, or like Linnaeus's apostles, these people who would go out and try to collect everything, clearly they did a lot of bad things. But one of the things that I did appreciate is that they would go around and just, at any cost, just try to find plants and try to document them. And they would go so far and put their lives at risk in order to find these things. And it's inspirational to read those kinds of accounts because you're like, wow, they didn't just like sit on their butt and Google things all day or read a book on something. Like they would physically go out there and just put their bodies in harm's way almost every single day of their adult lives. And many of them perished by doing such a thing. And then the modern person who's doing this is Sam Thayer. I mean, he's working on his field guide right now. And he'll call me up and be like, yeah, I just drove down to Texas over the weekend and got this plant and then drove back up to Wisconsin. I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe someone's actually still doing that kind of thing. He'll just go out there and do it. And he has firsthand experience with everything that he talks about because he's actually going out and doing it. So when people come at me and say like, do you think another wild food book needs to be written, or do you want to write a wild food book? I'm thinking nobody can do it because Sam's doing it the best that anybody can do. Like nobody's willing to spend 6 years of their life doing such a thing. And so it's just inspirational to know that somebody like him exists.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder, like he comes up on this show so much. I wonder if to a casual listener who's not maybe that deep into the wild food world, who doesn't really know who he is, it's like they must be like, God, why are they always talking about this guy? But I mean, it truly like probably the greatest, mind in wild foods of our generation, at least, if not, of several generations. So, but just such a cool regular guy in some ways too. He's just a great guy to hang out with. But I wanted to also talk with you about when, let's say, like I was talking about my wife showing that red oak leaf. So let's talk about genus like oaks, Quercus. Sometimes I'll go places and I'll meet an oak species, like when I'm in the South and I see the live oaks. And I would just, most of the oak species, when I look at the leaf, I don't necessarily know the species, but I know that's an oak by those, deep sinuses in the leaves. Then I'll see, like a live oak, and it's like, oh, I never would have guessed that was an oak. Or I'm thinking of box elder, not necessarily to my eye a maple. When I look at the foliage, the way I would know most of the maples, even though they're different by, again, those sort of deep, that distinctive shape with those deep sinuses. So is that something that you found to be a challenge when you're learning tree identification, is that some of these species can be like outliers in the sense that they don't necessarily conform to the same morphology that usually typifies the rest of the genus?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see a lot of examples like that with bitternut hickory or yellow bud hickory. That's another case. Shagbark hickory, shellbark, pignut hickory, mockernut hickory. These are hickories that all look not exactly alike, but they share many features with one another. And if you look at their winter buds, they all kind of have overlapping scales. But when you look at yellow bud hickory, it's different in that, first, its fruits are bitter if you eat them raw, which is not true for those other species that I mentioned. But also the winter buds are pure yellow, and they don't really have conspicuous overlapping scales. And so what I've found is that when you study flower and fruit morphology, just morphology, not really the taste of it, but the flower and fruit morphology, usually those are the best indicators of a particular genus. And unfortunately, those are features that aren't available all year. Mm-hmm. And they're not features that are always available even in a given year. I mean, sometimes just fruits won't appear on a particular tree for many different reasons, and you might need that fruit in order to identify that particular tree. But with something like oaks, I mean, if you look at flowers of oaks, they all kind of look pretty similar. The female or pistillate flowers are really small and inconspicuous, and the male flowers are those drooping catkins that are typically produced in clusters. And similar for hickory as well. I mean, hickory has inconspicuous female flowers, but they're beautiful if you find them and if you look at them. And then they've got those drooping catkins as well. So whenever I learn a particular tree, I always zoom out a bit and try to study the genus first and see what the shared features are. And usually it's not found in the bark. It's not even really found in the leaves either, because like you mentioned with box elder maple, that's got compound leaves. It looks like an ash tree or poison ivy, but you look at something like a sugar maple and it's just got a simple leaf with only one undivided leaf blade. But if you look at the flowers, you will see that there are similarities. And of course, when you look at the fruits of box elder, you would clearly say that that's a maple tree. And so for anybody who's trying to learn tree identification and you find different tree species to be quite confusing, maybe study flower and fruit morphology and you'll see a lot of similarities.
Well, a lot of people don't even really think about the flowers of trees unless it's something, let's say something that people, see, be the word, like ornamentally, like a lot of folks up here grow dogwoods or magnolias that have just these magnificent flowers in the springtime. But otherwise, like one thing I've noticed is in the springtime, and you may have a similar phenomenon, I'm not sure really about the distribution of maples where you are, but here our red maples in the springtime, wow, just after the maple season ends, the maple syrup season ends, these beautiful red flowers come out and it starts to paint the entire canopy red. So you could basically tune this out, and most people have or never have tuned it in. But once somebody turns you onto it, my friend Arthur, I remember just one year being like, Daniel, pay attention this year to how psychedelic the canopy is in the spring when the maple flowers are out. Now I find it almost as striking as the fall foliage, in the sense that entire hillsides are crimson with maple flowers and the average person's not seeing them, like truly not seeing them. And in their eyes, or the way they're interpreting the world, the trees still don't have leaves yet. So it's just like the dead canopy. And I'm like seeing this Dr. Seuss, like, kaleidoscope of reds kind of spread or dispersed over the canopy. But I think a lot of times a lot of the tree species we've been talking about have very small flowers. They are not that noticeable unless you're looking, and people tend not to look up in general anyway. So I think a lot of people miss that a lot of these trees flower like that.
Yeah, I mean, you said it so beautifully. And a lot of field guides omit those features. They might put it in text, like what it looks like, and provide a size, but they don't show pictures of it. And that's unfortunate because a lot of times you can instantly identify a tree based on its flower. And the other thing with flowering, kind of like you said, the timing of tree flowering can be essential for tree identification. Because like you said, red maples and silver maples flower first, at least where I live. Mm-hmm. Something like sugar maple flowers last. I mean, you won't see its flowers around here till late April, early May, where in March you're seeing red maple and you're seeing silver maple. And then other flowers take a long time. Like the oaks don't flower until late April through May. The walnuts don't flower until late April through May. Something like sumacs, they don't flower until June or July. Or something like winged sumac or shining sumac, which doesn't flower around here until August. So if you pay attention to the timing of flowering, you will be able to successfully identify trees much more efficiently. But that's something that, at least in my experiences, has never been taught to me. And I didn't realize this until I spent many, many years just disciplining myself to learn trees. And then we're just talking about angiosperms here, the trees that produce true flowers. But conifers, they don't produce true flowers. But, and I know you know this, they've got those male pollen cones, but they've also got seed cones. And I know we're familiar with the woody structures, but one of my obsessions, and I'm really obsessed with this, is finding the immature unfertilized seed cones. Like with eastern white pine, those seed cones take 2, maybe even 3 years to turn into those woody structures. But in the first year, they're small and they're pink and they're absolutely beautiful. They're gorgeous.
You can eat. They're soft enough to eat, meristematic enough.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, you can eat them. And they taste great. And they're so soft and no digestive issues associated, at least in my case.
I've always wondered about taking those immature seed cones and brining them and seeing if I can make something like a caper or something like that with them, but I haven't ever actually tried it.
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of people, I think, on Instagram. One person posts something, so every other forager has to post the same exact thing or slight variation on it. And everybody's making like a pine cone syrup or something like that. And I guess you could do that. It sounds great, but I don't like to add a lot of sugar into my diet. So a lot of these recipes for like adding more sugar into something, I'm just not a fan of, which is why I like making meads and alcohol stuff, because you take all the sugar out of it. And so you're getting all the goodness minus the sugar.
Some of the sugar out of it.
If you make a mead and you make it completely dry,
you gotta make it pretty dry. Yeah.
Yeah.
This year I was sitting in my tree stand one day deer hunting, and it was just one of those days where like nothing's happening, and I'm just sitting there watching red squirrels in the hemlocks, and I was seeing how they were pulling the seeds out of hemlock cones, which are so small. Like I guess like a hemlock cone up here would be, I don't know, like smaller than the tip of my thumb or something. They're fairly small, and I'm sitting there, so I start pulling hemlock cones off the tree while I'm there, and I just start picking them apart and being like, oh, there's a little seed in there, like the size of maybe like a sesame seed, with a little bit of that kind of coniferous flavor, that piney flavor to it, but also quite proteinaceous and oily too. And I'm kind of obsessed with the idea of doing an episode where I gather enough of those to do a pesto. I mean, it would be like incredibly time consuming because you're talking about pretty small nuts and a lot of labor picking them out. But the red squirrels kind of taught me, hey, there's a survival food in here if you ever need it. And just something I've never seen anyone work with, like hemlock seed, but it's got potential. So anyway, I think we're used to pine nuts, which are those must come from ponderosas. Is that where we get our pine nuts from?
Pinyon pine, I think.
Oh yeah, you're right. Pinyon. Thank you. No, you're right. Yeah, pinyon pine. So we're used to those like large pine nuts, but it's gotten me very interested in the edible seeds from coniferous trees. Very curious about those fruits.
Yeah, I've been eating a lot of them. I mean, whenever I find the cones as well, I break them open and I look for those seeds. And in good years, there's 2 of them pressed up against the back of a scale. And a lot of them have those wings on it, so I just pitch those wings. But I find that they're good, they're tasty, but like you said, they're so small. But sometimes if you find like a bumper crop, I mean, you could get enough to maybe satiate you on the spot. And of course, if you spend lots of time and maybe if you have some help, you can gather a lot. But as far as I know, I mean, a lot of those conifers, the seeds, not every single one, but a lot of the ones that grow around here, like the spruces, the hemlocks, the pines, as long as you find the seed, you can eat them.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things like if you're on that show alone, you could just sit there in the evenings around your fire with a lap full of these things and pull out some calories, it's not like worth it when there's other things in the woods, but sometimes too, we'll end up with like it's wintertime and we need, like last year I was pretty close to filming a segment on it because it was getting a little late in the season. We needed one more plant segment. And I was like, man, there's something there. So that one's like on the back burner right now, but I think I'll return to it at some point, But are there any other? You were talking about sort of that interest in those immature seed cones, and how those are not flowering. So describe to us a little bit about how they work. I think that's pretty fascinating, particularly with some of that like windborne pollen and stuff.
Yeah, so conifers belong to a group called gymnosperms, which are different than the angiosperms. I know I threw those terms out there a couple times. So angiosperms are the true flowering plants. So it's not just trees, but like orchids and onions and apples and petunias. These are all angiosperms because they have true flowers and they have true fruits. Gymnosperms, on the other hand, do not have true flowers and they do not have true fruits. And again, this is all like botanically speaking, according to humans. So who's to say what's a true flower or true fruit? But the word gymnosperm means naked seed. And so the conifers are gymnosperms. And some other groups of plants like ginkgo biloba is a gymnosperm, ephedra, and a group of plants known as gnatophytes. These are all gymnosperms. And naked seed, I've come to learn over the years because I used to say, okay, so their seeds are naked. They're exposed to the environment. And then I started finding juniper plants and I'm thinking, wait a minute. So here's this berry-like structure and the seed is inside something. So that definition doesn't really apply to a juniper, but the true definition, naked seed, actually applies to the ovule, which is the precursor to the seed. And so the ovules are naked. They're exposed to the environment. And the ovules are the things that are fertilized by the sperm, and then they become the fruit, they become the seed. The ovary would become the fruit. And so gymnosperms, like conifers, do not contain ovaries, so they technically don't produce fruits, but they have analogous structures. So if you take a look at like an eastern white pine, where I live in Western Pennsylvania, maybe the third week of May, you start seeing these yellow pollen-rich structures that just shoot out so much pollen anytime there's wind or rain. I mean, they don't forcibly discharge, but you need some kind of mechanical action to set it off. You could just flick it with your finger and all this pollen will come out. And these are the pollen cones. So it's the quote unquote male structures. But what people don't really see many times is the unfertilized seed cone, which contains the ovule. Yeah. Now, some people see it the next year when it turns green before it turns brown, and they'll say, no, I'm seeing it right here. No, that's already fertilized. I'm talking about the unfertilized one, which is small. And in the case of eastern white pine, it's pink. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's as beautiful as any orchid that I've ever seen. Yeah. But you got to catch it at the right time.
When you say pink too, it's like pink, magenta, fuchsia, internally it's like a luminescent. Color. Yeah, it's quite pretty.
Yeah, and not every conifer unfertilized seed cone is going to look like this, but with eastern white pine, it is. Yeah. And so you'll see these on the same exact trees as the pollen cones because pines are what are called monoecious. So male and female structures are on the same tree. And so pollen's going to land hopefully from a different tree so that genetic variation will occur in the offspring. Will land on the ovules and fertilize it. And then if it's successful over time, this immature unfertilized cone will turn green and then brown. And this can take a year in some conifers, like with spruces, they all pretty much develop in 1 year. With hemlocks, it's 1 year. With a larch, it's 1 year. But with pines, it could take 2 years, it could take 3 years, maybe even more years. And then it's eventually going to develop into this woody structure. But it's interesting because in no field guide that I own, and I own a lot of different tree field guides, and I've seen a lot, you never, ever, ever see any discussion on the unfertilized cones or even see a description. And if you Google this stuff or use a search engine, you hardly find any photos of these structures. On some of these trees you will, but many times I'm trying to find out what they look like, and I've never seen a photo of them. And so I'm trying to capture all this stuff, and I have no idea what I'll do with it. But at least I got it on a
what do you
hard
mean
drive
you have no
somewhere.
idea? You're doing a book. You're writing a book about it. Are you kidding?
No, the online course. I'm not writing a book yet.
Come on. Listen, you're just like, people are always telling me, all right, you got to write a book. And like, should there be another wild food book? And now you're telling me this content doesn't exist in book form. Hello.
Well, here's the thing. I do own one book that has some of these photos. It's got 13 conifers.
I don't own that book, but if I saw that book by Adam Haritan,
but I don't think it's a bestseller. That's the thing. So I
Yeah.
don't think this book would. I mean, this might sell to some of my friends and maybe to you, but that's about it.
All right. Well, hey, you can please consider writing that book. You've got me feeling really inspired about this. And I do think in the wild food world, it's just really easy to overlook a lot of these species. And the more you do any kind of bushcraft or live with the land, the more valuable and important each of these species is. And the more you realize, like, almost every one of these tree species plays some vital role in our lives. So it just seems like a thing that we should put a little more emphasis on. So I appreciate that you're doing this course, and man, I sure would like to see a book out of you at some point. So just putting it out there, just pushing you gently, my friend, pushing you gently.
Yeah, likewise. I'd like to see one from you too.
Oh, come on. I'm pumping out content. Adam, tell people about how they follow you and how they get involved in your course next time it runs.
So if you go to learnyourland.com, you can sign up for the email newsletter. I do have a YouTube channel. Occasionally I post on social media, but most of the stuff is either on the website.
You have a fantastic
or on
YouTube channel, by the way. I just
Thanks.
such a huge fan of the way you've done your YouTube channel, the way it's labeled and organized and whatnot. I just think it's fantastic. So I really recommend it to folks listening.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
Man, I look forward to our next conversation. It's always really fun to talk to you and always really inspiring, man. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for being I guess you're like the Lorax, voice of the trees.
Today, we'll see about tomorrow, the next year. Constantly shifting, but maybe
once
today,
you get the book out, you can move on to something else.
Well, yeah, you too.
Adam, thanks a lot, man. Great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.